Good morning. My name is Elizabeth Clark Lewis. I'm Director of Public History here at Howard University. And I think it's important when we talk about scholarly activities, we have to be honest and upfront. So upfront, I'd like everyone to know that I'm from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, that I had an appointment as a visiting distinguished professor at Penn State, and that I'm currently working with a church called Mother African Church, which is on 5th Street in Wilmington, Delaware. They had extensive records and resources that they were very concerned about making sure that that information came to Howard, that there were deep concerns about the materials, and it's a fascinating center and group to work with. With that said, when we talk about preserving women's history, I'd like to talk about my own background, the descendant of a slave and his 33 children, 3 wives and 33 children. And that third wife, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to interview 4 of the living children, 3 of which were women, and they helped me with what we call mnemonic devices. They had extensive photographs, they had extensive Bibles, and one had a diary that she found for me. And although in Virginia it was against the law for them to get more than a 3rd grade education, with 33 children it wasn't going to be possible for them to go more than 3 years because they were all working. And they're household workers. They started off in the South, and then using chain migration, they migrated out of the South. But what I learned is that there was a great deal of planning and writing and design for the way they wanted to be remembered. They had a great deal of not only material culture, but they had clothing. Many of them had extensive abilities and opportunities to fashion their own clothes. And one woman, who's referred to as simply a seamstress, was far more than that. She was a designer. And whites brought her pictures, and she could replicate anything, and she did very, very well. So when we begin to talk about material culture and how we preserve it, it's important to get to those people who are the sources and who work in preservation. And I am drawing a blank, but the lady, give me your last name again. Ms. Tyson works with a group called CREED, which recreate Civil War era women down to each stitch in the clothing. And so when you begin to talk about preservation and the way it's presented, it helps us understand presentation and preservation in an extremely different way. When we think about how people preserve materials, and I'd like to talk about preserving women's history like the women that I interviewed for a book, who basically preserved what they had as they could. They used brown bags, and in many cases they would wrap the materials and then put them in drawers, having enough sense to understand that that would be a protected environment. So in the homes of women that I'm going into now in Wilmington, and still because of my work here in Washington with these household workers, they're able to pull materials out and they're in pristine shape. Understand that this doesn't just mean in the areas where we are. We are going to Pittsburgh. Howard began the August Wilson Society, and the August Wilson Society has had a long history of not only preserving materials about the writer Wilson, but we've done an extensive oral history with the people who were there when August Wilson started. Not August Wilson when he was the famous August Wilson, but these were the people who came to see his presentations in the community centers of the housing projects. And many of them went to high school with him, and many of them admitted he was considered a little on that edge, because he would sit in libraries and restaurants and mainly bars, and he would write on napkins, and he was pulling together these sources. And many of them remember him in the most intimate way. And many of them are black women. And they talk about how his impact of his plays and his writing, there was there were conversations in the beginning in these housing projects when he was writing about women, when they would tell him, no, so-and-so, the jitney did so-and-so, and they helped him craft and understand women's history. I think as responsible stewards of African American history, we have to respect as responsible stewards of African American women's history, we have to respect African American history. And what we really are developing are what I call racial landscapes and cultural heritage management. And I would love to think that I'm so bright and I'm so great that I think of these things, but I don't. And I'd like to use a contemporary example. We are looking at the 100th anniversary of Colonel Charles Young riding from Xenia, Ohio to Washington, D.C. to prove to the United States that he was fit to be an officer. As the third graduate of the Military Institute up in New York, he was an Army officer. He had helped create very first protection areas for the sequoia, the great sequoias. And what we were tasked through a grant to look at is the fact that they have pictures of the African Americans at the base of this large mountain, Mount Whitney. They have pictures at the top, but it's still questionable if those African Americans built the roads. I'd love to know how they think they got up there. Did they jump? We are wonderful people, but we can't jump. So we're looking at that. At the same time, and I'm going to embarrass my class, I'm going to ask my class members to stand since they embarrassed me. Stand up, all of you. I see you in the back. Stand up, stand up, stand up, stand up. There's a lady there with 2 children. Stand up. They made it clear, well, if we're looking at Colonel Young, which was wonderful, what are we looking at in terms of those people around him? So they have forced a conversation on not just Colonel Young, but also his wife and the many individuals around him. And I'd like to, in particular, ask Mr. Wilson to stand, because Mr. Wilson, along with Miss Page, Miss Edwards, and Miss Bell, and particular Ms. Zanders, could you stand? Miss Eberhardt, not only looked at, are there any others of you in here? Not only looked at Colonel Young and his family, but his wife. They're down to what church they went to during the time they were here for the ride. They looked at where he's been able to stable his horse. They have given an intimate view of this issue. Thank you. And again, as I said, they forced me to think past what are those easy bounds when you talk about preserving African American history. The one person who couldn't be here is a young woman who's doing a film on Anna J. Cooper. She received a national endowment, and hopefully she's going to be able to use that as part of her dissertation. Ms. Lewis, who is no relation to me, is a filmmaker from the University of the District of Columbia, and she did a film called Aunt Sis. I don't know if you've seen it. It's wonderful. And she is getting grants to expand it. And what she's able to talk about as I said in my presentation, that when we talk about cultural heritage management, she is talking about how you use film and film resources to understand how they filmed the house, they recreated how she had the house in that era. But what they really did was understand this racial landscape that Anna J. Cooper and African American women in general were creating. When we think of preservation of women's history and material culture, as I said, the group of women that I focus on are women who are not probably going to be in the Radcliffe collection at Harvard. They're women who are at everyday churches, who are working almost in a way that's effortless, but not invisible. And I'd like to close with the example, as I said, of a woman who was a seamstress. And you learn, in many cases, you learn from various people, but it's really hard to learn from your children. But I have a daughter who is a talented preservationist, and she was able to show how this woman, this seamstress, and her activities and the clothing she created, each decade of her work, how it evolved sewing initially and generally for African American, what we would consider club women and women of the upper class, but also showing how the evolution of clothing and work evolved with women's history and women's material culture. And she uses one collection of just one seamstress and that she dug around and found. And I warned her, I said, I don't think that's gonna work. I don't, but what do I know? And I'd like her to stand, Dr. Abner Lewis Moon, who's going to be very angry, but she did an incredible job on using material culture. And I'm so glad Miss Beatty just walked in, because this is the student, when we were talking about Colonel Charles Young, who again in class corrected me because I was seeing him in a US context. She had done the reading, and they're always so gentle. You're wrong. I said, excuse me, I'm not wrong. She said, you're wrong. And she talked about Colonel Charles Young and the influence he had all over West Africa. I had a general sense, but again, they dug in the archives and created a whole new but very dynamic view of him, which talks about not only correcting me in the sense of as a US trained historian, I'm US centric, but we understand that there is an African diaspora element to almost every African leader, and as well as the material culture. So as I said, I think that what happens is uniquely interesting when we're talking about African American women and African American women's culture and preservation. But I ask you to remember that a significant part of what we have to preserve when it comes to African American women's history and material culture, we have to stop, we have to look for the people who have and understand their culture, and we have to listen to the words, their words, about how their cultural landscape and their material culture history has evolved. Thank you very much. And again, I would like to thank those recalcitrant, often rude, very difficult students who have helped me understand not only Colonel Charles Young, but all of history and material culture and women's history in such a new and unique way. Thank you all again.